My roommate told his parents my startup idea was his and pitched to investors using my prototype. Now he's being sued for fraud. The notification came through at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday in March. I was still awake, debugging a memory leak in the recommendation engine I'd been building for the past 8 months. My phone buzzed against the desk, and I glanced over expecting another automated deployment alert. Instead, I saw a congratulations message from Darius Webb, a venture partner at Meridian Capital, whose office hours I'd attended twice at the incubator. The message said he was excited to move forward with Series A discussions after the impressive pitch that afternoon. He mentioned being particularly impressed by the technical depth and market validation. For 3 full seconds, I stared at the screen trying to make sense of words that didn't connect to anything in my reality. I hadn't pitched anyone that afternoon. I'd been in the apartment writing code since 9 that morning. The memory leak had been driving me insane for days, and I'd finally isolated it to a specific function in the caching layer. I'd barely left my desk except to microwave leftover pad thai around 2. Then it clicked with a sick certainty that made my stomach drop. I looked toward the closed door of the second bedroom where my roommate Gavin slept. We'd been splitting a 2-bedroom in South Park for 14 months, ever since we'd both gotten accepted to the same startup accelerator program. Gavin was working on something involving blockchain and supply chain transparency that I'd never fully understood. I was building Prism, a machine learning platform that could analyze user behavior patterns across multiple applications to generate hyper-personalized content recommendations. The technology could predict what someone wanted to read, watch, or buy before they consciously knew they wanted it themselves. I'd made the mistake of explaining the whole system to Gavin 6 months ago when he'd asked about my project. We'd been drinking bourbon on the couch after a particularly brutal week where his blockchain pivot had failed to gain traction with mentors. He'd seemed genuinely interested in how the neural networks trained on behavioral data, how the recommendation confidence scores worked, how I'd solved the cold start problem for new users. I'd even shown him the prototype dashboard running real data from a small beta test group I'd recruited through Reddit. He'd asked smart questions about scalability and monetization strategy, nodding thoughtfully as I'd explained my vision for licensing the technology to media companies and e-commerce platforms. At the time, I'd felt good about the conversation. Gavin had been struggling and I'd wanted to be supportive, to show him that persistence paid off. Now that memory felt different. Those weren't friendly questions. He'd been taking notes on my phone, supposedly because he found my approach inspirational for his own pivot. I pulled up Darius Webb's full message again and read it carefully. He referenced specific technical implementations that I'd developed using terminology I'd coined myself. He mentioned the beta testing results showing an 87% accuracy rate in predicting user preferences, the exact number I'd achieved last month. He talked about the market opportunity in personalized media and how my solution addressed the recommendation fatigue users experienced with existing algorithms. Every single detail came directly from my project, from my 8 months of work. I opened my laptop and navigated to the shared Google Drive folder we used for apartment logistics. Gavin had access because we kept our lease agreement and utility information there. I created a new folder called Old Tax Documents and moved my entire Prism development folder into it, then removed Gavin's sharing permissions and changed the folder name back to something innocuous. Then I checked my GitHub repository where I kept all my code. The commit history was intact, showing my username on every single check-in dating back to July. I scrolled through months of commits, each one time-stamped and attributed to my account. The earliest commit was titled Initial Recommendation Engine Framework, and the most recent was from 8 hours ago, fixing that memory leak. I took screenshots of everything. The commit history, the README file I'd written explaining the project architecture, the issues list where I'd documented bugs and feature requests. I saved them all to a separate folder in my personal Dropbox. Something was very wrong and I needed proof of what I'd actually built. I went to LinkedIn and searched for Darius Webb's recent activity. His profile showed he'd attended a pitch event that afternoon at the Meridian Capital offices downtown. The event description mentioned portfolio companies and accelerator participants presenting to potential investors. My accelerator was one of the participating programs. I hadn't gone because I wasn't ready to pitch yet. I was still refining the product and wanted to have more beta users before approaching investors. Gavin had mentioned going to some networking thing downtown but hadn't specified what it was. I pulled up the accelerator's Slack channel and searched for messages about the pitch event. There it was, posted 5 days ago by Rachel Khoury, our program director. She'd sent out a call for participants interested in pitching to Meridian Capital, saying they were specifically looking for AI and machine learning applications. Gavin had reacted to the message with a thumbs-up emoji. I felt my hands start shaking as the implications crystallized. Gavin had pitched my project to investors as his own work. He'd presented my technology, my data, my results, and claimed ownership of all of it. The audacity was almost incomprehensible. We lived together. We saw each other every day. How did he think he could get away with something like this when I was literally in the next room developing the actual product? I stood up and walked to his bedroom door. My hand reached for the doorknob, then stopped. Barging in at 3 in the morning wouldn't accomplish anything productive. I needed to understand exactly what he'd done before confronting him. I needed to see his pitch, hear what he'd told investors, know how deep this deception went. I went back to my desk and started searching. I found Gavin's LinkedIn and checked his recent activity. He'd updated his profile 2 weeks ago. Under his current position at his blockchain startup, he'd added a second line describing himself as founder of Prism AI, with a description that was nearly word for word what I'd written in my Accelerator application. My Accelerator application that was stored in that shared Google Drive folder he'd had access to. My vision started tunneling. I clicked through to his company page, and there it was. Prism AI, registered as a Delaware C Corp 3 weeks ago according to the formation date listed on the page. The company description talked about revolutionary machine learning technology for personalized recommendations. The About section explained the neural network approach and the behavioral prediction algorithms using language pulled directly from my technical documentation. There were no team members listed besides Gavin as founder and CEO. I wasn't mentioned anywhere. I opened Twitter and searched for Prism AI. Gavin had created an account 4 weeks ago and had been posting regularly about AI innovation and the future of personalized content. He'd shared articles about machine learning with commentary that demonstrated surface-level understanding at best. He'd posted a photo from the Meridian Capital pitch event earlier that evening, showing himself standing in front of a projection screen. I couldn't make out the slide content clearly, but I could see charts and graphs that looked familiar. I took a screenshot of everything. The LinkedIn profile, the company page, the Twitter account, the pitch event photo. I added them all to my evidence folder. Then I did something I wasn't proud of, but felt completely justified in doing given the circumstances. I opened Gavin's laptop that he'd left on the kitchen counter. We both knew each other's passwords because we sometimes needed to grab files or check on deployment processes when the other person was out. His password was the same one he'd been using since college. His desktop was cluttered with files and folders. I found a folder labeled Pitch Materials and opened it. Inside were PowerPoint slides, financial projections, and a pitch script document. I opened the presentation and felt my stomach turn. Every single slide was about my technology. The opening slide showed the Prism AI logo that Gavin must have designed himself. The problem slide talked about recommendation fatigue and filter bubbles using examples I'd documented in my research. The solution slide explained my neural network architecture with diagrams I'd created. The traction slide showed my beta testing results with my 87% accuracy rate. The market slide presented my target customer analysis and revenue projections. The team slide showed only Gavin with a bio that claimed he had a computer science background and 5 years of machine learning experience. Gavin had studied business and marketing. He'd taken exactly 1 programming course in college and had barely passed. His blockchain startup had been built using a white label platform that required almost no actual coding. I opened the pitch script and started reading. Gavin had written out his entire presentation word for word. He claimed he'd been working on Prism AI for the past year. He said the idea came to him while working in digital marketing and noticing how poorly existing recommendation systems performed. He described the technical development process using vague language that sounded impressive but demonstrated no real understanding of how the algorithms actually worked. He mentioned the beta testing and the results, positioning himself as the architect who'd built everything from the ground up. Near the end of the script, there was a section about funding needs. Gavin was asking for $1.2 million in seed funding. The financial projections showed revenue scaling to $8 million in year 2 based on licensing deals with media companies and e-commerce platforms. Those were my projections. I'd spent weeks building that financial model based on market research and conversations with potential customers. I copied the entire pitch materials folder to a USB drive I found in my desk drawer. Then I went through Gavin's email. I felt a momentary hesitation about privacy, but pushed it aside. He'd stolen 8 months of my work and was actively trying to raise money based on lies. Whatever ethical boundaries existed had been demolished the moment he'd submitted that pitch. His inbox was full of correspondence about Prism AI. I found emails to Rachel Khoury from 2 weeks ago asking about the Meridian Capital opportunity and requesting an invitation to pitch. I found emails to someone named David Zhang at a law firm about company formation and intellectual property protection. That one made me pause. Gavin had hired a lawyer to file intellectual property protections for my technology. I opened the full email thread and found an attachment. It was a provisional patent application for Systems and Methods for Behavioral Prediction and Content Recommendation, filed with the USPTO 4 weeks ago. The application listed Gavin as the sole inventor. The technical description was copied almost verbatim from my architecture documentation. My hands were actually shaking now. This wasn't just lying to investors. Gavin had filed a patent application claiming he'd invented my technology. If that patent were granted, he could potentially prevent me from using my own work. He could sue me for infringement of intellectual property that I'd created. The legal implications were staggering. I kept digging through emails. I found a thread with his parents from 3 weeks ago with the subject line, Investment Opportunity. Gavin's father, Richard Sutherland, was a managing partner at a private equity firm in Connecticut. His mother, Diane, served on several corporate boards. They were wealthy people with access to serious capital and business networks. In the email, Gavin had sent them his pitch deck and asked if they'd be interested in investing. He'd explained that he'd been working on an AI startup in stealth mode and was ready to start raising capital. He'd asked for $200,000 as a friends and family investment to help him secure additional funding from institutional investors. The response from his father came 2 days later. Richard said he was impressed by the technology and the market opportunity. He said he'd discussed it with Diane, and they were both interested in supporting Gavin's entrepreneurial journey. They'd wire $150,000 to help him get started and would consider additional investment once he'd secured a lead investor. They'd already wired the money. I found a follow-up email from Gavin thanking them and confirming receipt of the funds into the Prism AI corporate bank account. The money was real. Gavin had actually taken money from his parents based on fraudulent claims about owning my technology. That moved this from unethical behavior into criminal territory. Wire fraud, securities fraud, theft of intellectual property. I wasn't a lawyer, but even I knew this was potentially prosecution-worthy. I copied all the relevant emails to my USB drive, then carefully closed everything and put Gavin's laptop back exactly where I'd found it. I went to my room and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling trying to process what I'd discovered. Gavin hadn't just pitched my idea. He'd created an entire fraudulent company, filed a patent application, taken money from his parents, and was actively seeking additional investment from professional venture capitalists. He'd built an elaborate structure of deception and seemed to genuinely believe he could maintain it. How did he think this would work? Did he expect me to never find out? Did he think I wouldn't notice when investors started calling about my own technology? Did he plan to somehow force me to work for him building the product he'd claimed to have already built? The psychology behind it was baffling. I couldn't sleep. I lay there until sunrise watching the light change through the window and trying to decide what to do. Confronting Gavin directly would likely just lead to denials and excuses. I needed to document everything first and figure out the legal situation before he knew I was aware of what he'd done. At 7:30, I heard Gavin's alarm go off in his room. I stayed in bed listening to him move around the apartment. The shower ran. Cabinet doors opened and closed in the kitchen. The coffee maker burbled and hissed. Around 8:15, I heard the front door close and lock. I got up and confirmed he'd left, then went straight to my laptop. I needed legal advice immediately. I searched for intellectual property attorneys in San Francisco and started calling offices as soon as they opened at 9. The first 3 firms I reached said they couldn't see me for at least 2 weeks. The 4th firm, Brenner and Associates, had a cancellation and could fit me in at 11 that morning if I could come downtown. I said yes immediately and started gathering my evidence. I organized everything into a clear timeline document showing when I'd started working on Prism, every major development milestone, the GitHub commit history, the beta testing results, and then all the evidence of Gavin's fraud, the pitch materials, the patent application, the emails with his parents, the company formation documents. I printed everything and put it in a folder. I also brought my laptop to show the actual working prototype and code repository. The law office was on the 42nd floor of a building near the ferry building with views stretching across the bay. A receptionist took my information and had me wait in a conference room with glass walls overlooking the city. 15 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and sharp eyes came in and introduced herself as Natalie Brenner. I spent the next 90 minutes walking her through everything. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she sat back and looked at me with an expression that was hard to read. She asked if I had documented proof that I'd developed this technology before Gavin started claiming ownership. I pulled out my printed GitHub history showing 8 months of commits, my accelerator application dated July with detailed technical descriptions, emails with beta testers dating back to December, and even receipts for cloud hosting services I'd paid for to run the prototype. Everything showed I'd been working on Prism since last summer while living in San Francisco. Natalie asked what evidence I had of Gavin's deception. I showed her the pitch materials copied from his laptop, the patent application listing him as inventor, the emails with his parents asking for investment based on false claims, and the company formation documents for Prism AI. Natalie's expression shifted from neutral to seriously concerned. She explained that what Gavin had done potentially constituted multiple criminal offenses including wire fraud, securities fraud, and theft of trade secrets. The fact that he'd taken money from investors including his own parents based on false representations made it particularly serious. She said I needed to act quickly because Gavin was apparently continuing to pitch investors and could potentially secure additional funding before the fraud was discovered. She recommended I take several immediate steps. First, file a provisional patent application for my technology in my own name to establish legal priority as the inventor. Second, send a cease and desist letter to Gavin demanding he stop representing himself as the creator of my technology and return any funds obtained through fraudulent representations. Third, report the fraudulent patent application to the USPTO. Fourth, consider whether to report the fraud to law enforcement. She said her firm could handle the first 3 steps immediately. The criminal complaint was more complicated because it would require working with the district attorney's office, and I'd need to decide if I wanted to pursue prosecution. The legal fees would be substantial. She quoted $15,000 to handle the patent filing, cease and desist, and USPTO complaint. More if this escalated to litigation. I felt my chest tighten. I had maybe $8,000 in my bank account. I'd been living on savings and a small stipend from the accelerator program. I couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle. Natalie must have seen my expression because she explained they could work on a contingency basis if we ended up filing a civil lawsuit to recover damages. She also mentioned that intellectual property theft cases sometimes resulted in settlements that covered legal fees. But the immediate defensive work needed to happen regardless to protect my rights. I asked if I could think about it, and she said yes, but emphasized I shouldn't wait long. Every day, Gavin continued operating as Prism AI's founder made the situation worse. I left the law office feeling overwhelmed and went to get coffee at a place on the Embarcadero. I sat outside watching ferries come and go while trying to process my options. I could confront Gavin directly and demand he confess and shut down his fraudulent company. But he'd already taken money from his parents and pitched to institutional investors. He was heavily invested in the lie and unlikely to just admit defeat. I could report him to the accelerator program and let them investigate. Rachel Corey would probably be furious that one of her participants was committing fraud using resources and access provided by the program. But that wouldn't solve the patent issue or get back the money his parents had invested based on false pretenses. I could file a lawsuit and pursue civil remedies, but that required money I didn't have and could take years to resolve. Meanwhile, Gavin could continue fundraising and building a fraudulent company on top of my stolen work. The only option that felt decisive was reporting him to law enforcement and letting prosecutors handle the criminal case. But that meant potentially sending my roommate to prison. We'd been friends before this. We'd gone through the accelerator program together, shared meals and drinks and late-night conversations about our startups. He'd seemed like a good person struggling with a failing business. Had I completely misread him? Or had desperation pushed him into making catastrophic choices he'd normally never consider? My phone buzzed with a text message from Gavin. He said he'd landed a meeting with another investor for next week and wanted to celebrate over dinner tonight. The casual tone made me furious. He was actively continuing the fraud while living in my apartment and pretending we were friends. I typed out a response saying I was busy, then deleted it. Instead, I wrote back saying dinner sounded good and asked where he wanted to go. I needed to hear what he'd say to my face while I knew the truth. Maybe confronting him directly would make him understand the severity of what he'd done and convince him to come clean before this got worse. We met at a Thai place in the Mission at 7. Gavin was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table in the back with a beer in front of him. He looked relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen in months. The stress that had been written across his face for the past year seemed to have evaporated. He waved me over and stood up to do one of those half-hug handshake things. He said he was so glad we could finally hang out properly. The past few weeks had been insane with everything ramping up. I sat down and ordered a beer from the waiter who came by. I asked Gavin what had been keeping him so busy lately. He launched into a story about his blockchain startup finally getting traction after months of pivoting. He said he'd found a new angle involving supply chain verification and had been meeting with potential customers. He talked for 10 minutes about technical details that sounded plausible but vague. I waited for him to mention Prism AI. He didn't. He kept talking about blockchain and supply chain until our food arrived. We ate for a while, making small talk about the accelerator program and other startups in our cohort. Gavin asked how my recommendation engine project was going. The question was so brazenly casual that I almost laughed. I said it was progressing slowly, and I wasn't ready to pitch investors yet. I said I wanted to have a more polished product before approaching anyone with serious capital. Gavin nodded sympathetically and said timing was everything with fundraising. He said investors wanted to see momentum and traction, not just potential. He said I should probably speed up development if I wanted to catch the current market window before AI recommendations became oversaturated. I took a drink of beer and decided to push slightly. I asked if he'd been to any pitch events lately. Gavin's expression didn't change. He said yeah. He'd gone to a few networking things downtown, trying to meet people who might be interested in blockchain applications. Nothing had really panned out yet, but he was staying optimistic. He was lying directly to my face with the same ease he'd probably lied to investors and his parents. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't desperation or a moment of weakness. Gavin was a fundamentally dishonest person who felt no guilt about stealing and deceiving people who trusted him. I asked how his parents were doing and whether they were supportive of his startup journey. Gavin's face lit up. He said they'd actually just invested in his company, which was amazing because it validated that he was building something real. He said having family support meant everything, and he was determined to make them proud of their investment. I asked how much they'd invested. He said 150, and they might put in more once he closed his seed round. He said they believed in him and wanted to help him succeed. He was using their money, obtained through fraud, to continue the fraud. I couldn't sit there anymore listening to him lie. I put down my fork and looked at him directly. I said I'd seen the congratulations message from Darius Webb about the Meridian Capital pitch. Gavin's smile froze. For just a second, I saw panic flash across his face. Then it smoothed back into casual confidence. He said, oh yeah, that was exciting. He said he'd actually pivoted away from blockchain after talking with some mentors and had started exploring AI applications. He said he'd been meaning to tell me about it, but wanted to wait until things were more concrete. I asked what kind of AI applications specifically. Gavin took a drink of beer and said personalized recommendations based on behavioral data. He said the technology used neural networks to predict user preferences with really high accuracy. He said he'd been working on it quietly for a few months and just started pitching investors this week. I asked if he'd built a working prototype. Gavin said yeah, a basic version was running with a small test group showing really promising results. He said the accuracy rate was up around 85 or 90%, which was pretty incredible for a beta product. I asked if he'd filed a patent application. He said his lawyer had submitted a provisional application a few weeks ago to protect the intellectual property before he started talking to investors. He said it was important to secure legal ownership early in the process. I leaned back and said, that was interesting because I'd been working on the exact same technology for the past 8 months. I said my project was called Prism and used neural networks to generate personalized recommendations based on behavioral analysis. I said my beta testing had shown 87% accuracy, and I'd been documenting everything in my GitHub repository since last July. I said it seemed like a remarkable coincidence that Gavin had independently developed identical technology at the same time. Gavin's face went pale. He didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he started stammering about how there must be some misunderstanding. He said obviously we'd talked about my project, and maybe he'd unconsciously absorbed some of the concepts. He said he hadn't meant to step on my work. He said we could probably collaborate or merge the projects somehow since we'd both been working on similar ideas. I asked if that's what he'd told Darius Webb, that we'd both been working on similar ideas and maybe could collaborate. Gavin looked at his plate and didn't answer. I asked if that's what he'd told his parents when he asked them to invest $150,000 in his company. I asked if he'd mentioned that the technology he was claiming to have invented was actually being developed by his roommate, who he'd watched write code for months. Gavin's voice came out quiet and defensive. He said I was making it sound worse than it was. He said he'd been struggling with his blockchain startup failing and had been desperate to find something that would work. He said, when I'd explained Prism to him, it had seemed like such a brilliant idea, and he'd thought maybe he could build something similar. He said once he'd started working on it, the lines had gotten blurred about where his work ended and mine began. He said he hadn't meant to deceive anyone. I asked if he'd actually built anything himself, or if he'd just stolen my pitch materials and presented them as his own work. Gavin didn't answer. I asked if he'd ever written a single line of code for the recommendation engine, or if he'd just described my algorithms to investors and his parents. He said he'd been planning to hire developers once he raised money. He said lots of technical founders brought in engineering help after securing funding. He said the important thing was the vision and the market strategy, not who wrote the actual code. I told him that wasn't how intellectual property worked. I said the person who invented the technology owned it, not the person who pitched it to investors. I said he'd filed a patent application claiming to be the inventor of systems and methods I'd developed. I said he'd taken money from his parents based on false representations about owning technology he'd stolen. I said that was fraud. Gavin's face flushed red. He said I was being dramatic and making legal accusations that didn't reflect reality. He said we'd had collaborative conversations about AI and recommendations, and he'd built his company based on insights from those discussions. He said that wasn't theft, it was entrepreneurship. He said lots of successful companies were built by people who took ideas from multiple sources and synthesized them into something new. I asked what he'd synthesized exactly. What had he added or changed or improved from what I'd shown him? He said he'd developed the business model and the go-to-market strategy. He said he'd created the pitch materials and the financial projections. He said he'd done all the investor relations work. None of that was invention. That was marketing. I told him he had until Monday morning to send a written confession to his parents, explaining that he'd misrepresented the origin of the technology and couldn't actually deliver the product they'd invested in. I said he needed to return their $150,000. I said he needed to withdraw the patent application and shut down Prism AI immediately. Gavin looked at me like I'd suggested he set himself on fire. He said there was no way he was doing any of that. He said his parents had already told their friends about his startup and were proud of his success. He said admitting he'd lied would destroy his relationship with them. He said withdrawing the patent and shutting down the company would kill his chance at a legitimate career in tech. He said he'd already committed to pitches with 3 other investors next week. He said I was asking him to humiliate himself and throw away his future. I said he'd done that himself when he'd chosen to commit fraud. I said the consequences were his responsibility to face, not mine to protect him from. Gavin stood up from the table. He said I was being vindictive and selfish. He said I was jealous that he'd actually taken action while I'd just been writing code alone in my room. He said we could have been partners, but I was too possessive about who got credit. He said I'd regret trying to sabotage his success. He threw $40 on the table and walked out. I sat there finishing my beer and feeling strangely calm. The confrontation had clarified everything. Gavin wasn't sorry. He wasn't confused. He'd made calculated choices to steal and deceive, and he was going to continue unless forced to stop. I paid the rest of the bill and went home. Gavin's bedroom door was closed and locked when I arrived. I went to my room and emailed Natalie Brenner saying I wanted to proceed with everything she'd recommended. The next morning, I wired $8,000 to her firm and signed engagement documents. Natalie said they'd file my provisional patent application by end of day Monday and send the cease and desist letter to Gavin simultaneously. She recommended I also contact Rachel Khoury at the accelerator and explain what was happening since Gavin had used program resources to meet investors. I sent Rachel an email requesting an urgent meeting, and she responded within an hour, saying she could meet that afternoon. Her office was in a renovated warehouse in Soma, with exposed brick walls and startup motivational posters. Rachel was in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back and an intense energy that made her both inspiring and slightly intimidating. She'd founded 2 companies herself before moving into startup advising and education. I'd always respected her straightforward approach to giving feedback. She listened to my entire story without interrupting. When I finished, she opened her laptop and pulled up Gavin's accelerator application and participation records. She said his original application had been for a blockchain supply chain company, and there was no mention of AI or recommendations anywhere in his materials. She said he'd never presented anything about Prism AI during any of the program sessions or office hours. She said the first time she'd heard about it was when he'd signed up to pitch at the Meridian Capital event 2 weeks ago. She pulled up his pitch sign-up form. In the description field, Gavin had written that he'd been developing an AI recommendation engine and was ready to start fundraising. Rachel asked if I'd reported this to the accelerator earlier, and I said no, because I'd only found out about it yesterday. She asked why Gavin had access to my technical documentation, and I explained we were roommates and had shared access to some cloud storage for apartment logistics. She made a note and said that was a painful lesson about information security with co-founders and roommates. She said the accelerator had a code of conduct that explicitly prohibited participants from misrepresenting their work or stealing intellectual property from other participants. She said Gavin had violated those terms and would be immediately removed from the program. She said she'd also be contacting Darius Webb and any other investors Gavin had met through accelerator connections to inform them of the fraud. She said she was sorry this had happened and felt partially responsible for not catching it sooner. I asked what would happen to Gavin's reputation after being expelled from the program. Rachel said expelled participants were usually blacklisted from other accelerators and incubators in the Bay Area. She said the startup community was relatively small and word traveled fast about bad actors. She said Gavin would find it very difficult to raise money or join reputable programs after this became public. That felt like cold comfort. Reputational damage wouldn't get back the money his parents had invested or undo the patent application filed in his name. Rachel must have sensed my frustration because she said I should consider filing a police report. She said the accelerator would support my claim with documentation showing I'd been working on Prism since joining the program, while Gavin's official project was completely different. She gave me the contact information for a detective in the San Francisco Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit, who she'd worked with on a previous case involving startup fraud. I thanked her and left feeling like things were finally moving in the right direction. I spent the weekend researching fraud cases and criminal prosecution. California law treated theft of trade secrets and wire fraud seriously, with potential prison sentences ranging from 1 to 5 years, depending on the amount of money involved. Since Gavin had taken $150,000 from his parents and was pursuing additional investments potentially totaling over $1 million, the charges would be substantial. Monday morning, I received the provisional patent application filing confirmation from Natalie's office. My name was listed as the inventor of the systems and methods for behavioral prediction and content recommendation. The application included my technical documentation, GitHub commit history, and other evidence establishing I'd developed the technology starting in July of the previous year. An hour later, Natalie emailed saying the cease and desist letter had been hand-delivered to Gavin at our apartment by a process server. The letter demanded he immediately stop representing himself as the inventor or owner of Prism Technology, withdraw his fraudulent patent application, return all funds obtained through false representations, and publicly correct any statements claiming ownership of work he hadn't created. He had 7 days to comply before we'd file a civil lawsuit for fraud, theft of intellectual property, and unfair competition. I was at a coffee shop working when my phone rang with a call from our apartment landline. I answered and heard Gavin's voice shaking with rage. He said I'd just destroyed his life. He said the process server had shown up while his parents were visiting to celebrate his funding success. He said they'd read the cease and desist letter and demanded an explanation. He said he'd had to admit everything. He said his mother had been crying and his father had threatened to disown him. He said they'd demanded their money back immediately. He said he didn't have the money anymore because he'd used $40,000 to pay lawyers and file the patent application and set up the corporate structure. He said the rest was sitting in the Prism AI bank account, but if he returned it now, he wouldn't have funds to operate the business. I told him there was no business. There was only fraud. Gavin started yelling that I was ruining his entire future over something we could have resolved privately. He said I could have just talked to him instead of going nuclear with lawyers and letters. He said we could have worked out a partnership agreement where we both got equity in the company. He said he'd done all the hard work of pitching investors and building relationships while I'd just sat around writing code. He said I owed him credit for his contributions. I told him theft wasn't a contribution. Lying to investors wasn't a contribution. Filing fraudulent patent applications wasn't a contribution. I said he could comply with the cease and desist or face a lawsuit, but those were his only options. He said fine, he'd comply, but he wanted me to know I was dead to him. He said we'd have to figure out a new living situation because he couldn't stand to be in the same apartment with me. He hung up. 2 hours later, I received an email from Gavin's lawyer saying they were withdrawing the patent application and would make a good faith effort to return the investment funds. The email requested I provide a timeline for reasonable repayment since the full amount wasn't immediately available. Natalie responded saying we expected full repayment within 30 days and would accept a payment plan only if secured by a personal guarantee from Gavin with interest accruing monthly. She copied me on the response. That evening, I contacted the detective Rachel had recommended and explained the situation. Detective Lisa Thornton listened to my story and asked me to come to her office the next morning with all my documentation. She said economic crimes involving stolen intellectual property were taken seriously, especially when the perpetrator had actively misled investors and family members to obtain funds. She said the district attorney would decide whether to file criminal charges, but it sounded like a strong case based on what I'd described. I spent Tuesday morning at the police station walking Detective Thornton through everything. She reviewed my GitHub history, the beta testing emails, the accelerator application, and then all the evidence of Gavin's fraud. The pitch materials, the patent application, the emails with his parents, the company formation documents, and the congratulations message from Darius Webb. She took copies of everything and said she'd forward the case to the district attorney's economic crimes division for review. She said I should expect follow-up questions as they built their investigation. She also asked if I'd be willing to testify if charges were filed. I said yes, without hesitation. When I got home that afternoon, I found Gavin sitting on the couch with his laptop. He didn't look up when I came in. The apartment felt hostile and tense. I went to my room and started looking for a new place to live. The lease was in both our names, but I didn't want to spend another day in the same space with him. I found a studio available for move-in at the end of the month and signed a lease that evening. I'd pay double rent for a few weeks until our current lease could be sorted out, but it was worth it to extract myself from the situation. The next week was surreal. Gavin and I moved around the apartment like ghosts, barely acknowledging each other's existence. He spent most of his time in his room on phone calls that I could hear through the walls. He was explaining the situation to investors and contacts, trying to do damage control. I heard him tell someone that there had been a misunderstanding about intellectual property ownership, and he was working to resolve it. He was still trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Rachel sent me an email saying she'd contacted Darius Webb and explained what had happened. Darius had been furious and said Meridian Capital would never work with Gavin under any circumstances. He'd also spread the word to other investors in his network to be cautious about Prism AI or any ventures associated with Gavin Sutherland. The startup community grapevine was efficient. Within days, everyone seemed to know that Gavin had been expelled from the accelerator for stealing another participant's work. On Thursday of that week, I received an email from the district attorney's office requesting an interview. I met with an assistant district attorney named Raymond Okoye, who specialized in white-collar crime. He'd reviewed the case file from Detective Thornton and said they were moving forward with criminal charges. He explained they'd be charging Gavin with wire fraud for obtaining money from his parents through false representations, theft of trade secrets for stealing my intellectual property, and attempted fraud for the investor pitches based on stolen work. The total exposure, if convicted on all counts, was up to 8 years in prison, though most first-time white-collar offenders received reduced sentences or plea deals. Raymond said they'd likely offer Gavin a plea agreement that included restitution, probation, and a felony conviction on his record. He said whether Gavin accepted would depend on his willingness to admit guilt and cooperate. I asked when charges would be filed, and Raymond said within the next 2 weeks. They were coordinating with the USPTO to gather evidence about the fraudulent patent application and with the SEC to review whether the fundraising activity constituted securities fraud. He said I'd need to be available to testify before a grand jury. The weight of what was happening started to feel real. This wasn't just a civil dispute anymore. Gavin was going to be criminally prosecuted. I moved into my new studio apartment at the end of March. It was smaller and more expensive than the shared place, but felt like freedom. I didn't have to navigate hostile silence or worry about what Gavin was doing in the next room. I could focus on my actual work again. I started rebuilding my network of beta testers and refining the Prism prototype. The technology still had potential, even though the path to market had been complicated by everything that had happened. In mid-April, I received a notice that Gavin had been indicted by a grand jury on 4 counts of fraud and theft. The indictment was public record. I found it online and read through the legal language describing his actions. Count 1 was wire fraud for taking $150,000 from his parents, Richard and Diane Sutherland, based on false representations about owning technology he'd stolen. Count 2 was theft of trade secrets for appropriating my intellectual property. Count 3 was attempted wire fraud for pitching investors, including Darius Webb, using stolen materials. Count 4 was making false statements to the USPTO in the patent application. Each count carried potential prison time and substantial fines. The arraignment was scheduled for early May. I wasn't required to attend, but I wanted to see what would happen. The courtroom was in the Federal Building downtown. I sat in the back row of the gallery and watched Gavin enter with his lawyer, a tall man in an expensive suit who I recognized from the email signature as David Zhang. Gavin looked smaller somehow, diminished. He wore a suit that seemed slightly too large for him and kept his eyes down as they approached the bench. The judge read the charges and asked how Gavin pled. David Zhang entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. The prosecutor, Raymond Okoye, requested reasonable bail given the defendant's access to family money and potential flight risk. The judge set bail at $100,000 and scheduled a preliminary hearing for June. Gavin's parents were sitting 3 rows ahead of me. I recognized them from photos Gavin had shown me back when we were still friends. Richard was a stern-looking man with gray hair wearing a navy suit. Diane was blonde and perfectly put together in a way that suggested significant time and money spent on appearance. They both looked devastated. After the hearing ended, I watched them talk to Gavin and his lawyer in the hallway. Richard's face was red and angry. Diane was crying. Gavin stood between them looking at the floor. I didn't approach them. There was nothing I could say that would make the situation better. Over the next few weeks, discovery happened. David Zhang requested copies of all my evidence, including GitHub history, email records, technical documentation, and accelerator materials. Natalie coordinated with Raymond's office to provide everything. The prosecution also subpoenaed records from Meridian Capital showing Gavin's pitch and the investor response, records from the USPTO showing the patent application timeline, and bank records showing the movement of funds from his parents to the Prism AI corporate account. The evidence was overwhelming. In early June, David Zhang reached out to Raymond to discuss a possible plea agreement. I wasn't privy to the negotiations, but Raymond called me to explain what was being proposed. Gavin would plead guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of theft of trade secrets. The other charges would be dropped. He'd be sentenced to 3 years probation, required to pay full restitution of $150,000 plus interest to his parents, ordered to perform 500 hours of community service, and prohibited from serving as an officer or director of any company during his probation period. Most importantly, he'd have a felony conviction on his record. Raymond said the plea deal was reasonable given the circumstances and would save the time and expense of a trial. He said I'd be consulted on the restitution amount because I could claim damages for the harm to my reputation and business prospects. He said typically in theft of intellectual property cases, the victim could recover not just the direct financial loss, but also lost opportunities and emotional distress. I thought about what Gavin's theft had cost me, the stress and anxiety, the legal fees, the damage to my relationship with the accelerator and investors who might now associate Prism with fraud and controversy. The months of development work I'd have to redo because he'd poisoned the well. The violation of trust that made it harder to believe in collaboration or partnership. I told Raymond I wanted full restitution for my legal fees plus $50,000 for lost business opportunities. The total would be about $70,000. Raymond said he'd include that in the restitution order and see if the judge would approve it as part of the plea agreement. The plea hearing was scheduled for late June. I attended again. Sitting in the back of the courtroom, Gavin stood before the judge and admitted in a quiet voice that he'd taken money from his parents by falsely claiming he'd invented technology that belonged to someone else. He admitted he'd stolen trade secrets and used them to try to raise additional funding from investors. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for August. In the weeks before sentencing, I received a letter at my apartment. The return address showed it was from Gavin, though he'd moved out of our shared place months ago, and I didn't know where he was living now. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper. Gavin wrote that he knew I probably never wanted to hear from him again, but he needed to say something. He said he'd spent the past few months in therapy trying to understand why he'd made such catastrophic choices. He said he'd been so desperate to prove himself to his parents and to Ashley and to the startup world that he'd convinced himself taking my idea wasn't really wrong. He said he'd told himself he was just borrowing the concept and would build something different eventually. He said he'd lied to himself as much as to everyone else. He said he understood now that what he'd done was theft and fraud and betrayal of someone who'd trusted him. He said he was genuinely sorry for the harm he'd caused and knew an apology couldn't undo it. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know he took full responsibility. He said he hoped I'd continue developing Prism because it was a brilliant idea that deserved to succeed. He said he'd destroyed his own future, but hoped he hadn't destroyed mine too. I read the letter twice and then put it in a drawer. I didn't know what to do with it. Gavin's apology felt genuine but also pointless. Sorry didn't give me back the months of stress. Sorry didn't repair my reputation. Sorry didn't eliminate the criminal record he'd created for himself by making selfish choices. Maybe therapy would help him become a better person eventually. That wasn't my problem anymore. The sentencing hearing in August was brief. The judge reviewed the plea agreement and the probation department's recommendation. He asked Gavin if he had anything to say. Gavin stood and apologized to his parents, to me, to the investors he'd misled, and to the court. He said he accepted full responsibility for his actions and was committed to making amends. The judge sentenced him according to the plea agreement. 3 years probation with strict conditions, full restitution to his parents and to me within 36 months through a court-ordered payment plan, 500 hours of community service, and a permanent felony conviction on his record that would show up on every background check for the rest of his life. The judge said Gavin had displayed a profound lack of integrity and had damaged not just individuals, but the trust that made startup ecosystems function. He said he hoped the conviction would serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar fraudulent schemes. Gavin's parents didn't attend the sentencing. I learned later through the startup grapevine that they'd cut off contact with him entirely. The betrayal and humiliation had been too much. Gavin had moved back to Connecticut to live with an aunt while completing his community service and looking for whatever employment he could find with a fraud conviction on his record. I continued working on Prism throughout that summer and fall. The technology was solid, and the market opportunity was still real. In September, I met with a venture partner at a different firm who'd heard about the situation through Rachel. She said she was impressed I'd had the courage to pursue justice rather than letting the fraud slide. She said my integrity and willingness to protect my own work actually made me more attractive as a founder, not less. She introduced me to her partners, and I pitched Prism properly for the first time. 2 months later, I closed a seed round of $1.5 million led by her firm. The restitution payments from Gavin started arriving in November, $200 a month deposited directly to my account by court order. It would take years to receive the full amount, but seeing the automatic transfers was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected, not because of the money itself, but because it represented accountability. Gavin was facing real consequences. He was paying back what he'd stolen, literally and legally. I hired my first engineer in December, and we started scaling up the prototype for commercial release. The beta testing expanded to 2,000 users, showing consistent accuracy in the 90% range. Media companies started reaching out about licensing deals. Everything I'd envisioned for Prism was finally starting to happen, but on a foundation of truth and work I'd actually done rather than stolen credit and lies. I never responded to Gavin's letter. There was nothing to say. He'd made his choices, and I'd made mine. I ran into Rachel at a startup conference in January. She asked how everything was going, and I told her about the funding and the product development. She said she was proud of how I'd handled the situation, and that the accelerator now used my case as a teaching moment about intellectual property protection and ethical behavior. She said most founders would have just absorbed the loss or tried to handle it privately. She said going through the legal system sent a message that fraud wouldn't be tolerated. I thought about that conversation later while walking back to my office. I'd never intended to become a cautionary tale or an example of doing the right thing. I just wanted my work back and wanted justice for the theft. But maybe that was enough. Maybe standing up for what you created and refusing to let someone steal it was its own form of success, separate from any startup outcome. 6 months after sentencing, I received the final restitution payment covering my legal fees. Gavin had apparently gotten a job doing customer service for an insurance company and was paying ahead of schedule to clear the debt faster. I never contacted him to acknowledge it. The money arrived, the court paperwork confirmed satisfaction of that portion of the restitution order, and that chapter closed. Prism officially launched in March with our first major licensing deal signed with a media streaming platform. The technology worked exactly as I'd envisioned, analyzing user behavior and generating recommendations that felt almost prescient in their accuracy. Users loved it. The company grew from 2 people to 12. Revenue exceeded projections. Everything I'd hoped for when I'd started writing that first line of code in my cramped apartment was coming true, and Gavin Sutherland's name appeared nowhere in the story, except as a criminal defendant in a fraud case that served as a reminder about the cost of dishonesty. He'd tried to steal my future, and instead had destroyed his own. I'd protected what was mine and built something real. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.